Hey and welcome to Proper Horror Show. Today I'm reviewing a very special episode of The Haunting of Bly Manor. That is episode 8, The Romance of Certain Old Clothes, which is written by Leah Fong and directed by Axel Carolyn. This is not your typical episode. Where to start? Okay, let's start positive. This is kind of a creative episode. Obviously a whole load of effort has gone into it to make it look like it is set in the 17th century, and it is a break from my usual narrative. They have interestingly woven in another classic Henry James story, The Romance of Certain Old Clothes, and they've tied it into the overall story of The Haunting of Bly Manor. The broad strokes of the original story about Perdita and Viola Wingrave are the same. Henry James' original story as a gothic horror is naturally a lot more ambiguous than the TV show, which has to be very definitive and show you, a ghost done killed a person. As for originality, is this just filching another story? Yes, it absolutely is. Is that still kind of cool and creative? Yeah, kind of, it is. So as I said, this is removed from the main 1980s set storyline of The Haunting of Bly Manor and into the 17th century, where we focus on earlier inhabitants of Bly Manor, Viola and Perdita Wingrave. Their story, though separate and interesting on its own, is bundled into explaining one of the main mysteries of The Haunting of Bly Manor, namely that of the lake ghost, or the Lady in the Lake, as most people seem to call her. Another major positive for this episode is that it proved me completely right when I reviewed episode 5 and said that the Lady of the Lake is a ghost who is creating all the other ghosts in Bly Manor. Yeah, okay, I made a whole load of other predictions that turned out to be completely wrong, but in my defence, and before you step all over my confirmation bias, I did assume that the story was going to develop in a logical progression, so, more fool me. And another positive is that Mike Flanagan managed to bring back Kate Siegel, who is another one of his regulars, just for this episode. And I've said before, I really like that he works with a regular cast of actors. I think it's quite endearing. So yeah, as you can see, I've followed the episode's lead. I've switched up my style here. And just for reference, it was kind of a nightmare finding footage of old cinemas. I really wanted to go earlier, and this is the best I could do. So bear with me here. I honestly considered trying to do a zoetrope thing, so you did get off lightly. And now, sadly, before the customary barrage of criticism comes, which I'd like to say is atypical for my channel, I'm usually really positive about stuff. Before I began to criticise, I do want to say that I did largely enjoy this episode. I did enjoy the creativity, I did enjoy the effort, and I liked that it answered some of the questions. We are in the penultimate episode of the series, so it is about time we got some questions answered. However, if we're being honest, this was kind of an unnecessary and indulgent way to answer those questions. That might sound like a really harsh criticism, but I do not mean it that way. I am going to be harsh later, but this is not the harsh criticism. When I say this episode is indulgent, I mean it's being more specific. And that means that there are going to be some people who are absolutely blown away by this episode and it is their favourite. But if this isn't your thing, then this episode's going to be quite meh and underwhelming. I'm sadly on the latter side because this episode once again is hit by bad writing and by proof that Bly Manor as a whole is a lot more interested in an agenda than it is in telling a good story. It's kind of disappointing. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about that in my review of episode 9 and sort of covering the wider themes of the season. But yeah, the writing is once again the problem here. So a huge effort and a lot of money has been spent to make this episode look like it's set in the 17th century. But the writer, Leah Fong, unfortunately didn't want to make that effort herself. She either couldn't or wouldn't write a 17th century person. Leah Fong just wrote her 21st century opinions into the character of Viola, and essentially just makes Viola a mouthpiece for her politics.
And obey, to love, cherish, and obey.
So this is a repeated issue, by the way. It's not an isolated problem with Bly Manor. It's incredibly widespread that people will want to set a story in a certain time period, but they will really not make any effort to genuinely, sincerely connect to how someone from that period may have felt. It is a industry-wide failure of imagination, research, and also empathy, and it frankly harms every story you see it in. Now, this isn't a problem in a comedy like Austin Powers. You're not expected to take that seriously, but Even on the lighter-hearted end of the scale with a character like Captain America, you see this issue. So sticking with Captain America as an example, he's a man who's born in the 1920s, who effectively is frozen in time in 1945 and skips a whole load of progress and development to be awoken in, I think, the 2010s. Now, Marvel films are not super serious dramas, so, it would have to be handled appropriately for the sort of tone and vibe they're going for. But do you really think a man from 1945 is going to wake up in the 2010s and just be, with no acclimatization, 200% okay with, say, women's liberation, women working, pride parades, desegregation, women dressing scandalously, government-funded Planned Parenthood clinics, easier divorce, gay couples kissing in the street, collapse of Christian hegemony, the complete technological revolution in every aspect of American life, or the absolute explosion in the size of the state? I mean, for Steve Rogers, a man from 1945, that change in the relationship between government and citizen would be absolutely astounding. And even if he was progressive in 1945, he happens to be okay with every single one of those changes. So episode 8 is essentially the same problem, but in the inverse situation. It's not the failure of a character from the past in the modern, but it's the insertion of a modern character into the past. And it is to the detriment of the show and to this episode. Instead of something that would genuinely challenge the audience and be immersive and more challenging to write for, to try and connect to those values and understand who Viola was in the original Henry James, you get an authorial self-insert. You get a Viola Wingrave who is an anachronistic mouthpiece for Leah Fong's political opinions. And it ruins the immersion watching her, show those stuffy old patriarchs that strong independent women are the way of the future. Why bother setting it in the 17th century? Viola runs a family business, she refuses traditional marriage vows, she openly mocks and belittles the priest and the whole Christian religion, and she refuses the last rites. I mean, is any of this believable? Is this how a 17th century high society woman would act? Why not just have a tweet about Trump while you're at it, since we've apparently given up on telling a 17th century story? Now, I mentioned the last rites there because Viola Wingrave ends up rejecting biological convention as much as she rejects societal ones. She is killed, you might say mercy killed, by her sister, and ends up returning from the dead over and over again, emerging from the lake to seek her daughter. It's kind of a beautiful image, actually. I really need to praise how good this looks. This shot that they return to over and over with someone going to the lake, I think is absolutely gorgeous. As we've seen before in a number of episodes, Viola Wingrave as the Lady in the Lake follows a set path, leaving muddy footprints in her wake as she goes into the house to look for her daughter. Over the centuries, she keeps up this habit but becomes more intermittent, and her memory fades until she ultimately doesn't even know who she is or who she's looking for, and with that her features fade. There's quite a symbolism that they carry over with the other ghosts who also sort of lose their distinctive features over time. And given the different time span we're talking about here, so sort of 17th century, this might not actually conflict with the Haunting of Hill House at all. Those ghosts might have been a bit more recent and therefore not subject to this loss of personality and detail. As I said, as a Lady in the Lake, she follows this path, going into the house, looking in the master bedroom for her daughter, and then returning to the lake and killing anyone who blocks her. They end up returning as ghosts themselves, sort of trapped in Bly Manor by her will. That's explaining another piece in the puzzle about why Peter is unable to leave. Although there is potentially a major plot hole with that based on episode 2, but next review. Over the centuries, Viola carries on following this routine mindlessly, just seeking a child. And I don't know if that's meant to be a comment from the writer on the drive to motherhood costing women their individuality and agency. I don't know, maybe. Regardless, this establishes everything we need for the finale, and it catches us up with the end of the last episode and Viola Wingrave, the Lady in the Lake, finding and grabbing Danny and leaving us wondering, how is it all going to end in the final episode? Badly. Really, really badly. But that is something I'm going to cover in my review of the final episode and some closing thoughts on the whole season. That is everything I've got to say about episode 8. I will see you whenever I get the next one out. If you didn't catch it, last week I put out a video on how to have the perfect Halloween movie night. I know we are post-Halloween now, but I was really proud of that and I put a ton of work into it, so it would be really awesome if you check that out after watching this. And otherwise, if you like what I do, please do like this video, please tell me your thoughts on episode 8 below, and subscribe to the channel. As I've said many a time, this is a tiny channel and every new subscriber is an absolute delight. And as you can see, I love chatting with you all in the comments. That is all from me for now, and the penultimate review of The Haunting of Bly Manor. Imagine that. Cheers, y'all.
Durango 95 purred away real horror show.